I found out my parents betrayed me when a bank I didn't recognize called me, insisting I needed to verify details about a large loan. At first, I assumed it was a scam, but something felt off, so I pulled my credit report and nearly fainted at the sight of a $150,000 loan under my name. I'd never applied for anything even close to that. Once I calmed my racing heart, I called the bank back and asked for documentation. They emailed me the signed forms, which showed a sloppy version of my signature alongside my parents' names as co-signers. My address was listed as theirs, not mine. Everything pointed to one conclusion. My mother and father had forged my signature and taken out a huge loan, presumably without thinking twice about how it might affect me. Worse still, I quickly learned this loan was used to pay for my sister's extravagant wedding. I hadn't even been invited to that wedding. Cecilia, my older sister, always seemed to be the favored child, but I never dreamed my parents would prioritize her so completely that they'd commit fraud in my name. When I confronted them, they offered no real apology. My dad insisted it was just a temporary fix until Cecilia's new husband supposedly paid them back. My mom cried and claimed they did it out of desperation for her special day. I asked why nobody bothered to ask me first, and my mother mumbled something about how I'd never agree anyway. They assumed I'd be difficult, so they went behind my back. That alone stung, but the deeper wound was realizing my parents had no respect for my future or my rights. My own sister, who cut me off years ago over some minor disagreement, apparently had zero remorse about using stolen money to fund her dream wedding. I decided I wouldn't let them walk all over me anymore. I sought legal advice, determined to prove that this forgery wasn't my doing. My lawyer told me I had a case for identity theft and the bank might eventually remove my name from the loan if I pursued charges. It wouldn't be easy. Filing a police report against my own parents felt daunting, but I refused to let them destroy my credit and leave me drowning in debt. They betrayed me on a massive scale, and I wanted them to understand the consequences. At first, I thought maybe they'd fix it quickly if I threatened legal action, but they were strangely confident that I would back down. They played the family card, said I should be grateful they raised me, and insisted it would all be paid off soon. I knew better. My sister's husband was notorious for shady business deals, and he had a history of making promises he never kept. I braced myself for battle, unwilling to let this slide. Nobody else would look out for me. Certainly not my parents, who had abandoned everything. I reached out to a friend who worked in finance, hoping for a clearer perspective. He confirmed that if my signature was forged, I could dispute the loan and potentially force the bank to remove it from my credit. But he warned it might become a lengthy battle. My parents, meanwhile, tried to gaslight me into believing it wasn't a big deal. They swore they'd handle the monthly payments. I told them I wasn't about to trust their empty promises. My father grew hostile, accusing me of sabotaging family unity. My mother just wept and said I should understand how important my sister's wedding was. That made my blood boil. Was it so important that my own financial security didn't matter? They had no answers for that. I hung up every call feeling more betrayed. I decided to file a formal identity theft report. The bank took it seriously once I provided documentation of my actual signature, plus proof I hadn't been living at my parents' address. They launched an investigation and placed the loan on hold. Meanwhile, I contacted the credit bureaus to dispute the account, making sure nobody tried to collect from me. I expected my parents to panic and apologize. Instead, they seemed outraged that I was dragging our family's dirty laundry into the public eye. My sister texted me for the first time in years, demanding I drop everything. She claimed her husband's business deals would pay off soon and that I was being petty. She didn't even bother to ask how I was doing, just focused on her own crisis. I replied that if she truly had access to so much money, she could take the loan off my hands immediately. Her response was silence. I knew she was bluffing, just as my parents were. Nobody in this family was willing to accept responsibility for the fraud they'd committed. My lawyer recommended sending a cease and desist letter, demanding that my parents stop contacting me unless it was through legal counsel. He told me to document every phone call, text, or email for future reference. I felt a heaviness in my chest at the thought of waging legal war against my own mom and dad, but they crossed a line that no parent should cross. Every time I doubted myself, I remembered that I was not even invited to the wedding my stolen signature financed. That slight was the final spark that fueled my anger. If they could lie, cheat, and treat me like an obstacle, I had every right to defend myself. Blood might be thicker than water, but my parents made it clear where I stood. Even after everything, they expected unconditional loyalty. That was impossible now. I began building my case, collecting digital proof, emails, and the loan application logs. My parents were about to learn that betraying me had real consequences. I wasn't searching for a reconciliation. I wanted justice, and I wanted them to face the fallout they alone created. The police report was the next big step. I went to the station, heart pounding, and explained everything to an officer. Filing a complaint against my own parents felt surreal, yet I knew it had to be done. The officer listened, took notes, and asked if I had any proof tying them directly to the forgery. I handed over the documents from the bank, along with screenshots of text messages where my parents admitted they took out the loan for Cecilia. The officer said it was enough to open an investigation. I walked out of there both terrified and relieved. My phone blew up a few days later when my parents realized I had gone to the police. Dad called me screaming, accusing me of destroying our family. Mom begged me to drop it, blaming Cecilia's naive dreams and saying they only wanted her to be happy. I told them I was done listening. If they wanted to fix this, they could come clean to the bank and find a legitimate way to remove my name. Otherwise, I wasn't going to budge. The silence that followed was deafening. Cecilia tried to text me again, accusing me of craving attention. She claimed her husband was close to finalizing a massive contract that would cover everything. I asked why they hadn't covered it already. She had no answer. Eventually, I blocked her. At this point, the bank's investigation escalated. They told me they had enough evidence to reclassify the loan as fraudulent once the police confirmed the charges. My lawyer warned me that my parents might face criminal consequences. I just nodded, numb. They did this to themselves. Days later, I heard that detectives visited my parents' house. My mother called in hysterics, insisting she'd never meant to hurt me. But I saw through it all. She was scared because someone was finally holding them accountable. I remained calm and told her that this was the direct result of their choices. For once, she had nothing to say. My father sent me one final message, insisting I was cruel to do this and that I'd regret turning on my own blood. I stared at those words, remembering all the times I came second to Cecilia. This was the final straw. If that made me cruel, so be it. They forced my hand the moment they decided my identity was theirs to exploit. My attorney kept me updated on the legal process. Charges wouldn't be immediate, but the evidence was stacking up. I focused on my job and tried to keep myself sane as the storm raged around me. My sister's lavish wedding photos hit social media, and all I could think was how those flowers, that gown, those centerpieces were basically stolen off my back. I waited for the day my parents would truly understand the cost of lying to me. By now, I'd lost any hint of sympathy. They burned that bridge the minute they signed my name illegally. Eventually, the district attorney got involved. My lawyer told me the case was strong because of clear evidence of forgery and the digital paper trail linking the application to my parents' IP address. They were indicted on charges of fraud and identity theft. I remember reading that email and feeling an odd mix of triumph and despair. I never wanted to see my parents facing possible jail time, but I also knew this was the only way they'd learn. Once news spread, relatives started calling me to plead for leniency. They said my parents were good people who made a mistake. I refused to hear it. For years, I'd played second fiddle to Cecilia. This time, I was standing up for myself. My sister posted a tirade online, accusing me of tearing our family apart over a small loan. She conveniently left out that I wasn't invited to her wedding and that the loan was $150,000. When people asked her why she didn't just repay it, she vanished from the comments. I watched this unfold in a sort of numb detachment. My energy was focused on making sure the bank cleared my name and my credit remained intact. Slowly, the bank moved toward removing me from the loan. They saw enough proof to believe I'd been a victim of fraud. Meanwhile, my parents were saddled with the debt since they were listed as co-signers. That meant even if they avoided jail, they still owed a fortune. Word got around that they tried to refinance their home and failed, their credit tanking under the weight of this new liability. Friends who felt sorry for them told me I should reconsider pressing charges. They even said a felony conviction would ruin my parents' lives. I thought about how they'd almost ruined mine. Then I decided I owed them nothing. If they needed to beg the court for mercy, that was on them. The court hearings began. My parents showed up looking frail and exhausted. My mother tried to make eye contact with me. I refused to acknowledge her. My dad stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Their attorney requested a plea deal. My lawyer told me it was likely they'd plead guilty if they could avoid the worst penalties. I wasn't out for blood. I simply wanted my name cleared and for them to shoulder the financial burden. The judge set another date to finalize everything. In the meantime, my sister's life began falling apart. Her husband bailed when creditors started calling, leaving her stuck with wedding bills and a scandalized reputation. I felt no sympathy. She'd reaped exactly what she sowed. My parents had set all this in motion by forging my signature without a second thought. Now we waited for a legal resolution. Revenge, in my eyes, was watching them squirm under a burden they'd created. I had no interest in mending fences. This was about protecting myself from any further harm. I refused. The final hearing arrived, and the tension was palpable. My parents looked defeated. They each pled guilty to reduced charges, striking a deal that included restitution and probation instead of jail time. I sat there, stone-faced, listening to them admit they'd forged my name and taken out a loan without my consent. The judge asked if I wished to speak. I stood up, hand trembling, and explained how their actions had jeopardized my financial future, violated my trust, and made it impossible to see them as loving parents anymore. I requested strict enforcement of restitution so I wouldn't be saddled with any lingering debt. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. My parents avoided my eyes. I felt a wave of closure wash over me. They couldn't hide or brush this aside now. Their lawyer assured the court they would pay every cent back. Outside, reporters weren't present, but some distant relatives stood by whispering. I walked away alone, ignoring my parents' attempts to approach me. My mother's sobs echoed in the hallway, but I kept going. I had nothing left to say. In the weeks that followed, I finalized all the paperwork clearing me of responsibility for the loan. My credit score recovered, though it took time. I heard my parents eventually sold their house to manage the debt. Cecilia's marriage didn't last. Her husband fled once his phony deals fell apart. She called me one day, tearful and desperate, claiming she had no one else to turn to. I let it go to voicemail. She had shown me no compassion when I was fighting for my financial life. Why should I help her now? I blocked her number. My parents also tried reaching out, sending letters that shifted between guilt trips and apologies. It was too late. They'd crossed a boundary I couldn't forgive, so I ignored them too. I found a new sense of peace in the quiet that followed. Nobody was hounding me for money. The loan was fully out of my name. My apartment felt more like home, a place free from deceit. Some nights I lay awake remembering the good times with my parents, wondering if I should feel regret. But they made their choice, and so did I. I wasn't going to pretend everything was fine just to spare them consequences. They'd shown me exactly how little my well-being mattered to them. So I closed that door for good. Revenge, for me, was seeing them stripped of the comfortable complacency they'd once had. It felt like justice, and I had no shame about that. People say forgive and forget, but some betrayals run too deep. Mine sure did. What they did was unforgivable, and I never once considered giving them a pass. If they hoped time would heal this wound, they were mistaken. I shut them out and focused on rebuilding my life. Without their toxic presence, I felt stronger, clearer, and more determined to protect myself. They still existed in my past. Every so often, I hear snippets of their new reality. My parents live in a cramped rental now, barely making ends meet. Cecilia moved back to town, crashed on their couch, and whines about her failed marriage. None of them speak to me directly, but I know they blame me for exposing their crime. Some relatives shake their heads and say I took it too far. I don't care. They weren't the ones whose signature was forged for an astronomical wedding. They weren't the ones left with a crushing debt and no remorseful apology. My conscience is clear. I protected myself, and I would do it again. Friends sometimes ask if I miss having a family. I tell them I do mourn the loss of what could have been, but not the reality of what we actually had. My family dynamic was already skewed. This betrayal merely forced everything into the open. I have a new circle of people I trust, friends who genuinely care about me without demanding blind loyalty. I have peace of mind, knowing nobody is sneaking around behind my back, forging my name. That alone is worth any price. Sometimes I think of the day I discovered the forged loan. The shock, the fear, the heartbreak, it feels distant now, like a bad dream I finally woke from. Taking legal action was the turning point. Had I caved to guilt or pity, I'd still be stuck under that debt, powerless and angry. Instead, I chose to fight back. The satisfaction I feel isn't just about revenge, it's about reclaiming my agency. Nobody else can decide my worth or my destiny. My parents tried, and they failed. If they ever hoped for forgiveness, they won't find it here. My refusal to forgive is my boundary, my shield against further harm. They already proved they'd choose Cecilia over me at any cost, even if it meant risking my financial ruin. I learned not to let that happen again. Cutting them off was painful at first, but now it feels necessary. I am living proof that standing up for yourself can come with harsh consequences. You might lose people you once loved, but you keep your dignity intact. My parents gambled on me just rolling over, quietly paying off a wedding I never attended. They never saw the steel in my spine until it was too late. Now they're paying for their actions, and I don't lose sleep over it. That is the real conclusion to this story. My parents tried to steal my future, but they only succeeded in losing me forever. My sister remains bitter, surrounded by the wreckage of her fantasy wedding. She learned too late that illusions of grandeur come with a price. As for me, I'm finally free. If anyone dares ask if I'd ever forgive, my answer is simple: never. They can keep their apologies and excuses. I owe them nothing. This was my breaking point. They do not deserve it.